On a dark night, when thick fog enveloped the trees as if they didn't exist, Mark and his 3 friends set out into the forest, known for its sinister history. People spoke of disappearances, of strange whispers that echoed through the night, and of a forest trail that led to a place no one dared to go. This path passed by an abandoned house that locals avoided. They talked about something dark that lived there, an ancient entity waiting for its victims. Mark and his friends, Andrew, Alex, and Steve, decided to explore the place despite everyone warning them not to. "It's just legends," Alex laughed as they set off. But the deeper they went into the forest, the quieter it became. The night was so dark it seemed as if the sky was covered by a black blanket, hiding even the stars. Their flashlights cast faint beams of light, but it wasn't enough to cut through the dense fog. "Does anyone else feel like something's off?" Andrew asked, glancing around. "Don't start," Mark replied. "We haven't even reached the house yet, and you're already getting nervous." The trees that had seemed ordinary during the day now looked alive at night. The branches swaying in the wind resembled hands trying to grab them. The forest was breathing, and with each step in the dense darkness, it felt like someone, or something, was following them. Suddenly, they heard a rustle. It wasn't the wind or the branches. It sounded as if someone was walking alongside them. Alex stopped and turned, peering into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he asked, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Maybe it's just an animal," Mark suggested, though there was an edge of concern in his voice. But the rustling came again, and this time it was closer, as though someone was deliberately matching their pace, carefully, slowly. Steve turned around, trying to see what was behind them, but the thick fog obscured everything. "I don't like this," Andrew said. "Let's go back." But going back wasn't an option anymore. The path they had been following disappeared. Instead, in front of them stood the house, old, with a half-collapsed roof, overgrown with moss and vines, with windows that stretched into a haunting black emptiness. "What the?" Alex whispered, trying to understand how they reached the house so quickly. "We're heading back," Andrew said firmly, though his voice trembled. "No, we need to check what's inside," Mark insisted. His curiosity outweighed his fear. They cautiously approached the house, holding their flashlights out in front of them as if they could protect them from the darkness. The door was slightly open, and from inside came strange sounds. A whisper, or perhaps the wind, or something else. Steve stepped forward and looked through the window first. Inside, it was empty. No furniture, nothing. Just an eerie void. "There's no one here," he said, though his voice was uncertain. "Then why is the door open?" Alex asked, glancing nervously at the dark forest path behind them. "It's just the wind," Mark tried to reassure them, though even he didn't believe his own words. They entered the house, carefully inspecting every corner. The terrifying stories they had heard didn't seem so real anymore. But something still didn't feel right. An invisible threat hung in the air. The whisper they had heard earlier was growing louder. "Do you hear that?" Steve asked quietly, clutching his flashlight to his chest. "It's just the wind," Mark repeated. But now even he couldn't ignore the fact that the whisper was coming from one corner of the house. They moved closer to that corner, and the whisper suddenly stopped. In its place, there was cold. A cold so intense that it felt like someone, or something, was watching them. "Let's get out of here," Andrew shouted, backing toward the door. But when they tried to run, the door suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang. "What the?" Steve began, but his voice trailed off, and he stared at his friends in terror. Out of the darkness, a shadow began to emerge, large, black, shapeless, but with eyes that glowed with a cold, cruel light. It seemed alive, like the embodiment of pure evil. The entity. "What is that?" Alex asked, his voice shaking as he backed up against the wall. The shadow approached, and each breath they took felt heavier and more difficult. The entity remained silent, but its presence consumed everything around them. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest. They tried to find an exit, but the entity was everywhere. "Let's get out of here!" Andrew screamed, but it was useless. The shadow had already surrounded them, and then it spoke. Its voice was deep, cold, like it came from the depths of hell itself. "You all belong to me." Their flashlights went out, and the entity swallowed them in its darkness. The next morning, no one returned from the forest. Only the remains of flashlights were found near the old house.